Hey guys, welcome to the most opinionated space podcast on the internet,
Ad Astra, the podcast where we integrate space, policy, and technology.
I'm Jack.
And I'm Newton.
I have a Master's of Public Policy degree with a concentration in science and space policy.
And I'm a PhD in computer science and an all-around tech geek.
All right, guys, before we forget, make sure to follow us on Twitter at @AdAstra_podcast, like us on Facebook, and subscribe to our mailing list on elemental.fm to get regular updates from the team. And if you like what you hear, give us a review on iTunes and recommend us on Overcast. And for only 2 more weeks, Newton, go to elemental.fm/win to enter for your chance to win a signed copy of David Grinspoon's newest book, Earth in Human Hands. It's a signed copy.
Learn about the Earth. Learn about the Earth. This is
it is a great signed copy of a great book about Earth and the climate and science.
All of those things. All of the
fun things that we talk about on the Ad Astra podcast too. So be sure to subscribe.
So anyway, be sure to subscribe, guys. And today we'll be reviewing the latest from Washington, where we'll touch on new state legislation for commercial space and new federal legislation on space weather. We'll bring you the unclassified parts of a classified space mission for the space news highlight of the week. We'll discuss the first launch from Arianespace since the protests have stopped. And for the latest in tech, finally, we'll talk about Space Ethernet, this thing that I've been holding off for the last 2 weeks.
3 weeks. Or 2 weeks. 2 weeks.
It has been 3 weeks. Actually, it has been 3 weeks. No, we cut it off without telling the viewer 3 weeks ago. And last but certainly not least, we'll talk about the thing that Jack and I have been working quite hard on, Jack more than I, the Humans to Mars Summit, which will actually be happening by the time this episode airs.
Yes, so for all of you who are just tuning in to the Ad Astra podcast, if this is your first episode, give us a like on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and tell us your favorite space mission.
Absolutely.
In the comments. But no, welcome. If you are a new listener, I am sure we will have millions of you joining us. No, if you are listening, we are very thankful and very grateful for supporting us, and we hope you enjoy your first episode.
So right to the show. Latest from Washington. Governor signs Georgia's Space Flight Act. Georgia's taking what they believe to be a necessary step to show that they can be a competitive player in the commercial space industry. On Monday, May 8th, which is the day that we're actually recording this, Governor Nathan Deal signed HB1, the Georgia Space Flight Act. This act limits the liability of space flight operators that are launching tourists into space. Basically, it limits a willing spaceflight participant's ability to sue for damages related to spaceflight activities for which the participant must give informed consent. This bill introduces an industry standard that the Georgia House believes will be used in all other space-friendly states. So that should entice space tourism companies to launch from there, because effectively, if something happens, they're limited in their ability to get sued. Now, Camden County is on the southeast tip of Georgia, and the county is already working closely with Vector, a small satellite launch company founded by veterans of SpaceX, Virgin Galactic, McDonnell Douglas, and Sea Launch. In a statement, Camden County Administrator and Spaceport Camden project lead Steve Howard was quoted saying, "Commercial spaceflight is the next great space race. It is a $320 billion industry that offers tens of thousands of good high-paying jobs." Now, Howard was also quoted as saying HB1 put Georgia on the radar of the industry, and Governor Deal's signature only reinforces to those companies that Georgia wants their business. So, Jack, flying to space and preemptively limiting the customer's ability to sue. Your thoughts?
So here's a fun fact for you. The first fruit eaten on the moon was a peach. A Georgia peach, in fact.
Really? I did not know that.
Georgia has a pretty long history of being supportive of the space industry. A lot of the contractors and companies that work with Kennedy Space Center, just a few hundred miles south of them in Florida, are based in Georgia. Also, mostly because of the tax code there. Pretty tax friendly state. or so they try to be. My thoughts on this, this has been coming for a while. I remember hearing about Georgia's commercial spaceflight ambitions about 2 years ago when there was sort of this mumbling of opening up a spaceport in Camden County. I mean, it'd be ideal. I mean, it'd be more ideal than the Wallops facility. You can get to more orbit. So for those not so technically inclined, like myself at some point, at many points, the closer you are to the equator, the better launches you can, the more orbits you can obtain.
You're traveling faster when you're closer to the equator. You're covering more distance in shorter time period. Basically.
Yeah, and so you can make bigger adjustments using less fuel. It's more efficient to be launching from the equator, which we'll get into that. I mean, we've gotten into that before with Arianespace down in French Guiana, but that's why, I mean, launching things from, from Nice wouldn't make much sense. But launching things from a French colony on the equator makes a lot of sense. Anyway, back to Georgia, back to our domestic terrestrial issues. Georgia has sort of been mulling this over for a while, really wanting to break into the commercial space flight arena. I mean, we've seen it in traditional space states. Your California, Florida, Texas, and New Mexico all have either spaceports or government-funded launch facilities. With Texas and New Mexico being the commercial ones, Spaceport America in New Mexico, and the one that Jeff Bezos is building outside of West Texas. Outside of West, a couple 100 miles, but you get the picture. So Georgia's trying to break into this very new market, I think, with this, and they've been trying to for a while, and I think this really solidifies their commitment to it, because, like I said, I've only heard talk of this sort of being the next big space area, but this really solidifies. This puts money, well, not really money, but it puts a value on commercial space flight.
So limiting taxes is one thing, but what do you think about the notion of limiting the consumer's ability to sue? Not that this doesn't happen in plenty of other markets. Okay, there's plenty of legislation that has been passed in other arenas that limits the consumer's ability to sue. Now, for initial space tourists, this is a very dangerous activity, and companies probably shouldn't completely go bankrupt for when bad things happen. But I would be interested in seeing, just how much people would be limited in terms of their capacity to sue for certain incidences that could happen.
Yeah. So the getting into the headspace here, the legal framework that sort of surrounds this. So as it stands, there's not really a regulatory regime or this legal framework that decides all this. It's really decided by the contractor. If it's a commercial entity, it's decided by the parties in the contract, or if it's between the federal government and a launch provider, a launch service provider, the government decides. So as it stands, if the government buys a launch service, because they're not buying the rocket, they're buying the service of using the rocket. So if we have NASA buys a Falcon 9 service from SpaceX, and they launch out of Florida, and the rocket, something happens and the rocket comes back and lands on Orlando, SpaceX has to pay up to a certain point, and under current contracts that SpaceX has and that Boeing, ULA, and Lockheed have, the limit to the indemnification is $500 million. So according to the FAA, each human life is worth about $4 million. So SpaceX could kill something like 150 people and sort of, and they'd have to pay out of pocket up until that point, and then the government takes over as a protection for that industry that we are so heavily reliant on. Now, if this was 30 years ago, we did not even have this limited amount of regulation and legal substance around the issue. But now, as we're sort of moving into this era where access to space is vital to the economy and it's not just a luxury, certainly you could make the argument that human access to space is currently a luxury, but just access to space in general is a vital component of the economy because, I mean, whether you like it or not, everything that you interact with involves space, involves some amount of data.
Most things, yes.
I would argue all things. Like at some point in the supply chain anywhere, there's a packet of data that goes to some commercial communication satellite and comes back down. Like there's a lot that relies on space or GPS.
We have a heavy technological reliance on space.
Yeah,
which actually folds us right into our next topic, unless you have anything else that you wanted to say about commercial spaceflight in Georgia.
I was just going to say that, this is the first step, is defining this legal regime outside of the existing structure that the federal government created. Because if it's now private citizens making these contracts, the level of indemnification that affects the launch provider if something goes wrong, that's a conversation that then needs to start happening. And since it's an international issue as well as a local and state issue, this is like that first step to building up that framework that's eventually going to define access to space for the next 50 to 100 to a million years. I mean, we're really at the crux of this. Like we're putting the building blocks, the foundation for what the commercial spaceflight business is going to look like when it's not solely reliant on government funding. So yes, on to the next topic. And I sort of threw something in here that we don't need to talk about, but I want to mention is that California also I think it was a state senator or state worker or something talked about potentially California wanting to tax rocket launches from the coast, so from Vandenberg, to tax that by kilometer that the rocket goes. So the further you go, the less taxes that you pay.
What?
Or it's like the further you go from Earth, the less the percentage is. So you would pay more for a longer flight, but the percentage of what you paid to fly, it's very weird. And it's like
the goal there to kind of prohibit folks from just launching a significant number of very low, very, very low flying satellites or, just rockets in general? Like what?
Yes.
What are the bounds of?
There doesn't seem to be. I mean, you can read the article that I linked from Quartz. There was also a article that we could have linked for this, but I don't think we should. But
I don't. Tom, bleep that name out, please. I don't know who you're talking about.
So this article from Quartz is pretty all encompassing. But I think the point is just to start the conversation more than it to solve any policy problem right now. It's to start the conversation over how are we going to tax something that's theoretically going to become a very regular thing. If there's a commercial space launch every 2 weeks, like SpaceX wants there to be, just of its own rockets, and a majority of them fly out of Vandenberg, like California is seeing that as hey, we're going to start taxing this because they can't really fly out of anywhere else, and because they're building them there, they're not going to ship them over to Florida or to New Mexico.
It's interesting. They're kind of taking the opposite stance almost, in comparison to Georgia, where Georgia's saying, come, please come and launch things. Please, bring your space tourism here. Whereas,
here's the thing: is there's also two different levels of infrastructure. I mean, Georgia hasn't even built a spaceport yet. Like we're still maybe 10 years away from the first launch in Georgia, whereas California, there's probably a launch next week. Like there's like California is so much further on the development side of this, that they can start making this call. Which, so the thing is Georgia is more commercially focused. So this is tourists and passenger vehicles. So that's your Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, even though Blue Origin is going to fly out of Texas. Whereas in Vandenberg, it's all DoD, all NASA. So you don't really get too many commercial launches out of Vandenberg. So this is more a mechanism for California to then get a couple extra dollars. I mean, it's from what I can tell, it's not going to be something that's completely inhibitive or almost make up that $10 million difference that SpaceX is trying to cut by reusing its rockets. I don't think it's going to be $10 million in taxes, but it's starting that conversation, and I'm interested to see how this progresses because it's taxes. It can be a very divisive issue, and it's not something in the space industry that we've really had to deal with yet. I mean, same thing with indemnification on the East Coast in Georgia. That's also another thing that we really haven't had the conversation. So I think in the next year,
we're at such a nascent stage, but you're starting to see concrete laws take place for these real, very tangible things that are going to happen, that are going to be interacting with the populace. So it's an interesting time. So anyway, we got to get moving on to our next subject. The Senate passes a space weather bill.
My boy, Gary Peters.
My boy, Gary Peters. So on Wednesday, May 3rd, the U.S. Senate unanimously approved the Bipartisan Space Weather Research and Forecasting Act. It's now been referred to House Intelligence, which these days sounds like an oxymoron.
Hey, to all of our House listeners, we love the House. We'll come visit you soon enough.
Last week was a rough week, guys. What were you doing? The legislation will help the U.S. to improve our ability to predict and mitigate the impacts of extreme space weather events. So we're talking about events such as solar flares caused by coronal mass ejections, or what we call CMEs. Specifically highlighted were these kinds of naturally occurring changes caused by emissions from the sun that can cause disruption to our space infrastructure. Okay, disrupting our space infrastructure can lead to disruption of our communication networks, as well as disruption to critical infrastructure such as our power grid, leading to trillions of dollars in economic damage. As I said before, the bill was bipartisan. It was introduced by our boy Gary Peters, of a Democrat from Michigan, Cory Gardner, a Republican from Colorado, Cory Booker from New Jersey, Roger Wicker, a Republican from Mississippi, and Amy Klobuchar. There we are.
Our friend from Minnesota.
Our friend, a Democrat from Minnesota. Each of them highlighted the importance of doing this type of research and the great expense that can be caused by this type of damage to our infrastructure. So this bill's got something for everyone, and different combinations of everyone in it. I poked through just kind of the high level bullet points, and it really sets priorities for a number of science/space-based government groups. So let's break it down and kind of comment on each one of the groups that this bill directs. So the bill directs the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the OSTP, to coordinate the development.
Which might not exist for long.
Yeah, that's it's also true. They passed it, but it directs OSTP to coordinate the development and implementation of federal government activities to improve the nation's ability to repair, avoid, mitigate, respond to, and recover from potentially devastating impacts of space weather events, and coordinate the activities of the National Space Weather Program members. And keep in mind, the P in OSTP is for policy. So we're talking about regulations here. So kind of mining through, taking the science and identifying what important steps you could take, and then forming regulations based on those steps. Any thoughts, Jack?
So we've seen this as a model for OSTP, and if OSTP goes away and is replaced with the National Space Council, it's going to be almost interchangeable, except now Vice President Pence is going to be involved. But what what these White House policy working groups do is it brings in all of the key members of that policy area. So for OSTP/NSC, which we should call it something other than NSC because National Security Council claimed that already.
Right. Right.
NSPOC.
Ooh,
yeah, I like that. OSTP and NSPOC. Like you heard it here first, folks. So OSTP/NSPOC is made up of NASA, NOAA, NSF, the National Science Foundation, Department of Defense, Federal Aviation Administration, sort of bringing all of those together under one roof. And I even think Department of Commerce, even though FAA is kind of part of that, but Department of Commerce and the FCC sometimes get involved in OSTP and SPOC things. But that's sort of what they do is they bring everybody to the table and they say, all right, what are your individual agencies doing to address this issue that Congress told us to work on? And they all do a roundtable discussion about it. And then they decide on actionable items for the next, the meeting in 3 months from then.
So then it sounds like the OSTP will be kind of leading the charge for the requirements that have been placed on each of the other agencies that you named in there, NASA, NOAA, NSF, so on and so forth.
I would more say that OSTP/NSPOC is going to be the Bunsen burner under their feet. It's going to be the nagging paperclip on the Microsoft Word that is the federal government on, hey, you got to do this thing. Congress told us that we have to monitor space weather. We have to find solutions to that, all the while doing all the other things that you're doing. So what's probably going to happen on the individual agency or organizational levels is they're going to create a task force, and there's going to be someone in charge of the task force who's going to, appoint a bunch of people from all the field centers or sub-agency groups or directorates in the case of NASA who are responsible for their individual components. And it's just going to, in order to do this, they're going to have to create a bureaucracy of differing levels of involvement to sort of
you hit the nail right on the head, because it directs the National Science and Technology Council to establish an interagency working group on space weather amongst the agencies.
Yep. So
it directs that
alongside OSTP and NSPOC you have this working group that's going to meet. Really, it's really the meeting schedule. Like the working group's just going to meet more regularly to discuss these issues. OSTP/NSPOC are just going to be like, hey, like we need something to tell the president or the vice president about what's going on here, because it's been 6 months and Congress hasn't heard from us, and they're back on track to worrying about that. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, we've all had the boss or the person that we've worked with who their mind runs a mile a minute. And for like 5 minutes on one day, the biggest issue is space weather. I mean, maybe not every boss thinks about space weather, but certainly ours have.
I've had bosses. It's
going to be their it's going to be their big thing for 5 minutes, and you're going to be like scrambling trying to get all your paperwork together, and then by the time you get it all together, they're on to the next topic. Well, that's Congress. And so when Congress comes back, they're going to want to say, all right, how many working group meetings have you done? How many times has OSTP/NSPOC met? And what are your action items for the next phase of development? Or what is the report that you're coming out with? I mean, it's all this sort of this dance between all of these different groups and personalities and organizational cultures that allows you to communicate what's going on between the pieces in the federal government. And if you come up with a better way to do this, contact me at jack.corelli@gmail.com, and we will write a book on that. We'll rewrite the book on organizational culture.
There you go.
Because Weber did not do a good enough job. But
so a few more sort of high-level highlights about what this bill does. It directs the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, to secure a reliable secondary capability for near real-time CME imagery. So if one measurement device or measurement mission, I believe they're talking about stereo here, goes down, we'll have another one available, which is great for NOAA. If you recall the proposed White House budget talked about slashing a good chunk of NOAA, but this is something that's kind of unrelated to the programs that it was talking about slashing, the earth sciences programs.
Per our conversation last week on the new budget, seems like NOAA's coming out the other end fine. That is one thing that this bill, if passing the House, that's what this maybe eventual law doesn't do, is it doesn't allocate funds. So keep that in mind. This is it's not even an authorization, really. It's kind of just, I guess I'd consider it an authorization type bill. It's telling parts of the federal government to do a certain thing without really giving them money to do so. It's just adding on to the calendars, the Outlook calendars of all of the federal government employees on what they need to pay attention to and keep in mind in their day-to-day tasks.
So a few more things that this does. And basically they listed out a combined sets of missions for combined sets of agencies. So for a group between NSF, Air Force, and Navy must maintain and improve ground-based observations of the sun and provide space weather data by means of ground-based facilities, including solar observatories. So it sort of fits the Air Force and Navy into many of the solar observatories, and it gives them a high-level view of what those solar observatories are doing. It directs NOAA, the Air Force, and the Navy to conduct a survey to prioritize the needs of space weather forecast users. So expect new programs a new joint program coming out of that. It directs NSF, NOAA, and NASA to pursue multidisciplinary research in subjects that further our understanding of solar physics, and space weather. So that may allow them to sort of justify a few new programs with combined funding for that. A couple more. It directs NASA to implement missions meeting science objectives identified in the solar and space physics decadal surveys from the National Academy of Sciences. It directs NASA, NSF, NOAA, Air Force, and Navy to develop a mechanism to transition capabilities, research findings, models, so on and so forth, to NOAA and the Department of Defense Space Weather Operational Forecasting Centers. So just transition mechanisms amongst the different agencies, and to enhance coordination between research modeling centers and forecasting centers.
So I wonder if they flip a coin when they're making these decisions on these bills on whether it's NOAA or NASA that gets the space stuff. Because that's what it seems like to me. That's what I'm getting, is that it's directing NOAA to do the sun observations, the solar observations, and NASA's doing terrestrial observations and coordinating things there. Like
it's a mix. It's a mix of capabilities. Obviously, some of it's high level politics. Who owns what? Who owns what part of what mission in both NOAA and NASA? Obviously it's a Senate bill, so it's clearly politics. But to some extent, there's solar observations and identifying the impacts of those observations on, let's say our atmosphere. What can happen to our atmosphere? That's more in NOAA's territory if you're talking about it from the more mission-based perspective. And then if you're talking about it from sort of the critical infrastructure perspective, space satellites, things like that, then you're talking NASA. Now the problem is we get to ground-based observations and what can actually be impacted on the ground. I think that's where you start getting a little bit political. But
that's where you bring in DoD, because literally everything then has a national security bent to it.
Exactly,
and then it's like you have to have someone from the Air Force or the Navy or the anybody from DoD has to be on the ground in that room having that conversation with, whether it's NOAA, NASA, Department of Agriculture, does not matter. If it has anything to do with national security, DoD wants a piece of the pie.
Right, absolutely. This absolutely impacts the Department of Defense. In fact, the Department of Defense or DARPA specifically has a program out right now called Radix that's basically focused. It's very geared towards if something like this happens, although I think it was framed as, if a cyber attack happens to the power grid, what can we do? And that's going to be extended out to most forms of critical infrastructure. But space weather has a significant impact on all of our critical infrastructure, and not just the capabilities that we have in space. And the DoD is concerned about that. It's been in a number of DoD directives for the last, let's say, 5 or so years from DoD and DHS. And DHS actually got a little bit of this as well. This one actually talks about directing NOAA to inform DHS about space weather hazards, protect national critical infrastructure. So
DHS has purview over FEMA.
Right.
As well as so FEMA also has an office that deals with planetary defense.
Yes.
Which is interesting. I've met a few people from that office. It's a small office, so I might have met everybody from there. But that's if you're just tuning in to politics overall or the way the federal government works, this is like every issue. You have to have like 30 people at a table doing this stuff because you have to make sure that there's no duplicative programs going on or two things that are going to collide. Or it could be as simple as, this program that DoD is creating runs on this bit of software, and this program that NASA's creating runs on another piece of software, and they're incompatible. And then
they try, but that happens so much more than you think.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the mitigation for that is to keep
right. People at least recognize that it's happening and are trying to mitigate it as much as possible.
So again, if you have a better way of doing this, please contact me. You have my email or tweet at us at Astra_podcast. But we're talking a lot about weather, and I like the weather that's going on here, but I kind of wish it was sunnier, like in Florida, where the X-37B just landed after a 2-year-long mission in space.
Way to segue, sir. Way to segue.
I run the segue tours around here, sir.
I'll let you take it. Go ahead.
So the X-37B, which is I like to describe it as the space shuttle, but a third the size. Was in space. It's an Air Force program built by Boeing. It's an X-plane. If anyone knows what that means, it's basically an experimental vehicle that the Air Force sent up 2 years ago. I think it was May 2nd or May 22nd, 2015.
Yeah, it was May 2015. That's all.
Yeah, because they don't tell us the launch dates of secret spy satellites. So so this thing went up 2 years ago and just recently landed down in Florida. They did not notify the Florida air traffic controllers that this was happening. But the X-37B is a experimental payload delivery vehicle for the Air Force and the National Reconnaissance Office, and just basically all of DoD and intelligence agencies will be able to use the X-37B or whatever they end up calling it, mini shuttle. Right. And it's supposed to be the replacement for the shuttle on the DoD side. So it broke a record by spending about 718 days in orbit. It's the longest payload delivery system or autonomous payload delivery system in orbit in history.
So just a little bit of a background on X-37B. Back in 1999, the program to develop the technology for this plane was actually started by NASA. They were originally going to develop two planes, one one by the name of Alt-V, an approach and landing test vehicle, and another by the name of OV, an orbital vehicle. But the program was transferred to DARPA and classified back in 2004. Apparently, that's when the scientists knew too much.
They opened the vault.
So that technology was apparently transferred to the Air Force at some point, because in 2006, the Air Force announced it would develop the X-37B based on that technology. And just a little bit to touch on the plane, you said it's about a third of the size of the shuttle. Like it's about 29 feet long with a wingspan of 15 feet. Okay, that's tiny. Like that's I don't even have something to
compare that to the shuttle. Actually, in the video that we have linked below, when it's coming down on the runway, you can see a mock-up of the space shuttle, and it passes by to give you sort of one, that's kind of funny, but two, also to give you a sense of scale for like how small this thing actually is.
Right. Yeah. Check it out on YouTube in the show notes. What's an interesting fact about this one is back in 2011, representatives from Boeing announced that they were going to consider developing a larger variant called the X-37C, which could carry up to 6 astronauts to and from the ISS. And in addition, an engineering team lead from NASA, a former astronaut by the name of Stephen Robinson, had proposed to use a modified version of the X-37B as an ISS emergency evacuation vehicle. But this is just a concept. There are no plans, at least none that we know of, for doing
that we're allowed to know of.
That we're allowed to know of. But yeah, nonetheless, props to the Air Force, DARPA, as always, and NASA for once again advancing our place in space.
I like the marketing there for the Planetary Society.
Yes.
But, so it's
subliminal messages here at astrobiologist.
It's kind of funny to me because so our friend Jeremy just recently started watching The West Wing, and this immediately made me think of the later, I think it's in season 7 or season 6 of The West Wing, where Toby Ziegler, Richard Schiff's character, his brother is an astronaut on the space station, and there's an emergency, and Toby knows about a secret space shuttle, just basically the space shuttle but painted black because it's the military and everything's painted black in the military. And he knows about it. And I'm fairly certain the concept came from this because back in 1999, that was everyone was still talking about space planes, was a vehicle that could go up as a normal, launch vehicle, but could come down and land on any runway. Which was the original concept of the space shuttle, which was a modification then on the the X-20 dinosaur, you can look at the history of space planes and find it. It was one of the first concepts for a DoD NASA vehicle to get into space. But so this X-37B is very, very interesting. And that idea of a C variant that could carry astronauts. It's, I guess, you said Boeing came up with this idea in 2011. It's almost as if they were sad that the space shuttle was ending and had a replacement. Whereas, Lockheed Martin was like, hey, give us Atlantis and Discovery and we'll just refurbish them and keep launching them. And Boeing's like, nah, we can build another one. But, this again goes back into U.S. launch capabilities as we get further and further from the last flight of Discovery, or Atlantis. Atlantis was the last one. The last flight of Atlantis, that we're starting to, kind of have that itch of, all right, we need to start launching things again. And this test of the X-37B is great. So kudos to NASA scientists from 1999 to 2004, and then kudos to all of the DARPA scientists that we probably will never know from then on.
DARPA contractors. There are no DARPA scientists. Well, PMs are scientists. It's a long story.
That's a whole show in and of itself. We should just have one show that's like, let's break down all of the acronyms and titles within the federal government.
Yeah.
So
anyway, On to international news.
Let's go abroad.
Arianespace.
Let's go to French Guiana. This is
to French Guiana.
Is this the cap? Is this the end of our French Guiana news
until October 2018, sir?
well, in terms of these protests,
yes.
So French Guiana, Arianespace launched its first payload since the protest. So on May 4th, it completed its first launch of the name of the mission was VA-236. It's two communication satellites for Brazil and South Korea. It was launched on an Ariane 5 rocket from the Guiana Space Center. They are both, I think, if I'm reading this correctly, they are both geostationary communication.
Yeah,
satellites.
They were both placed in the geostationary orbit. With the first satellite, the Brazilian satellite, the SGDC as they call it, being placed in the upper stage, and the KoreaSat 7 being placed in the lower stage, and they were both plopped into geostationary orbit. And this mission was delayed. I believe it was supposed to happen on March 21st, and it was delayed a few days given the issues that were going on in French Guiana. And it's great to see them launching things again. And for listeners who haven't heard us talk about this, a series of protests and organized work stoppages caused Arianespace to delay the mission until the situation could be resolved. There was widespread. There was about 5 weeks where there were a massive bout of protests due to widespread displeasure over the economic disparity between mainland France and Guyana, and because that disparity was just made very clear at the Guyana Space Center, protesters formed blockades to effectively close off access to the spaceport, which forced Arianespace to delay its launch manifest. And after a series of negotiations between French politicians and Guianan protest groups culminated in an agreement in which France would provide substantial economic assistance and emergency relief to French Guiana, the protests finally ended. And then the spaceport opened back up in April 22nd, which allowed the French multinational launch provider to resume its operations. So, yeah, it's good to be launching to be launching things again. It was a short 5 week delay, and it seems like they're getting right back on track.
Yeah, with the next launch scheduled for May 18th. So that's
okay.
soon.
Where are they launching?
They are launching a Soyuz SES-15 mission. And then there will be a Viasat 2 and Eutelsat 172B on June 1st. So another dual launch on June 1st, but May 18th will be the next one there. I think if all goes according to plan, they're going to have 12 launches this year, even with the 5-week delay. So that's on average a launch a month, which is sort of the cadence that a lot of commercial space companies really want to reach. SpaceX a little more ambitious, launch every 2 weeks, but we'll see.
To Mars in what, 2020?
Yeah, Mars in 2020, and they'll do it in a week and a half.
Only slightly more ambitious than most folks.
Did you say Mars? Is that a segment coming up soon?
We'll get there. But first, we're going to finally do this latest in tech story that I've been holding off for the last 3 weeks. So this one's about space Ethernet. So I wanted to highlight a story that caught my eye from March's edition of IEEE Aerospace and Electronic Systems magazine. I have a subscription. You should subscribe to the group.
Nerd.
And I want to make it a mission to do this sort of a technical deep dive at least once every 2 or 3 weeks by analyzing these types of articles, as opposed to just kind of random news announcements. This one is with regard to the Cepheid project, which addresses the need for high-speed networking technologies to interconnect the different elements of a spacecraft. So here on Earth, we have a number of ways of doing networking. And no, I don't mean going to a local job fair. I mean ways of getting different kinds of computers to talk to each other. Now we're all used to and we understand Wi-Fi, which has grown in popularity. But the most cost-effective, reliable method of networking is through a family of computer networking technologies known as Ethernet. Ethernet describes a family of computer networking technologies commonly used in local area networks, such as within your house or at your workplace, metropolitan area networks, such as among college campuses in a localized area, or government networks across the city, and wide area networks. Think at the country level or the multi-country level. So computer networking works. It's implemented in layers. And two common conceptual models that describe these layers are what are known as the OSI model and the TCP/IP model. And I'm not going to go into the details about these models because we definitely don't have time for that. But the important takeaway is that the models describe how data is transferred from machine A to machine B. Okay? The layers of these models describe the flow of data through these machines in order for communication to take place. You start at the top, at the application layer of machine A, which views data in a way that's somewhat familiar to us, like HTTP websites and things like that. And you work your way down, that gets translated down the machine all the way to the physical layer of machine A, in which data is represented by bits, or rather electrical signals on a physical transmission medium. Machine B then receives those signals from machine A's physical layer and translates them back to its application layer, providing meaningful data to be interpreted by machine B. Okay. In order to understand the upcoming story, I think that's sort of a sufficient
You haven't lost me yet.
About.
For the listeners who we have lost, just listen to that one more time. Newton's good at explaining these things.
Just repeat it, replay it. There'll be a test on Thursday. All right. So now Ethernet is typically represented at that physical layer, and it's currently used for approximately 85% of the world's LAN-connected PCs and workstations. As I said before, it's low cost, it's efficient, and has a method of communicating that's robust to collisions thanks to a protocol known as CSMA-CD. Let me see if I remember it. CSMA-CD stands for Carrier Service Multiple Access with Collision Detection. You don't need to know it's not on the test, but just know it's what makes Ethernet awesome. So because of the large number of computing devices that will be on a spacecraft for a manned mission anywhere, suffice to say that Ethernet will be implemented to ensure communications amongst numerous devices on the ship. Now, devices, particularly those that communicate using high-speed Ethernet, have to process a large number of electrical signals using advanced signal processing techniques. This is done by what's called a physical layer transceiver. And this is where the paper starts to come in. This transceiver's job is to turn those analog electrical signals into digital signals and vice versa. The requirements for the integrated circuits within these devices that have to operate in space are very different from those that are used to operate here on Earth. In particular, the radiation is much more intense in space and causes several types of effects on the devices that compromise their reliability. So TLDR, most commercial components cannot be used for Ethernet communications among space systems. All right. That's the overall problem that this project is trying to address. So this is where SEFI comes in. SEFI stands for the Space Ethernet Physical Layer Transceiver. The project, which is funded by the European Union Horizon 2020 program, is to develop a space-grade Ethernet physical layer transceiver to enable widespread adoption of Ethernet in space. The project consortium is formed by different European companies and research centers led by Archimea. Innovations for high-performance microelectronics will focus on the digital design, and Universidad Antonio de Nebrija will focus on the verification. Atmel will be in charge of the fabrication of the integrated circuits, and TT Tech and Thales Alenia Space, Spain, will integrate and test the silicon prototypes on a network and perform the radiation testing for this transceiver. And so in the IEEE article, basically they went into detail about the problems with using what we use now on Earth in space and potential mitigations for radiation hardened Ethernet. For instance, the most commonly used media in Ethernet are what are known as what we call UTP, unshielded twisted pairs. These are what most people just simply refer to as their Ethernet cables. So when you're plugging, your Ethernet cable into your router, if you have a desktop, most people use Ethernet cables. Your odds are you're using unshielded twisted pairs. But there are different kinds of these cables that permit different speeds of Ethernet and connections to different connections to different kinds of devices. And each of them, as you would imagine, have different types of those physical transceivers, those things that I mentioned that turn analog to digital, digital to analog signals. The authors of the IEEE article point out that as the speed increases, so does the complexity of the transceiver. It makes sense. The faster something's coming in, the harder it's going to be to decode that signal. For instance, certain standards such as 10G-base-T, which is the standard for a type of cable transceiver that can handle 10 gigabits per second, needs analog to digital converters and complex digital signal processing functions that run at more than 800 megahertz. It's very difficult to achieve those speeds with available space-grade technologies. But for instance, at about 1,000 base T, which represents about 1 gigabit per second, and are implemented in older technologies, those may present a more ideal option for a radiation hardened implementation. So with that in mind, Cepheid will start even slower by targeting the implementation of 10 base T and 100 base T standards. That'll provide 10 megabits per second and 100 megabits per second connectivity in space systems. That compares to the solutions currently used in the space domain, like MIL standard 1553B, which, I mean, we all know about MIL standard 1553B.
Oh, absolutely.
Right,
I read that before I go to bed. That standard is just for low. Think about that standard as defining low data rate, large cable length based Ethernet, right? And space wire, which is high data rate, short cable length. Okay. So those two standards sort of map to the 10 megabits per second and 100 megabits per second connectivity. So they're trying to research a way to get just normal standard Ethernet at those speeds to give you the flexibility to construct your ship, or the network, or the local area network on your ship. The proposed transceiver will meet the cable length and data transfer requirements, which are 100 meters and 100 megabits per second, respectively. And they'll do so not only for launchers applications where cable length is the main constraint, but also for the onboard communication requirements where high data rate is required. Meeting these standards can be implemented with a reasonable cost and provide a solution to space industry needs in the short term. So it makes the most sense for them to start at those lower levels. The development of something like even 1,000 base T transceiver would require a much larger cost. It would require much more time and much more risk. That would likely jeopardize the adoption of Ethernet, especially given the timeline of some of the major missions that we've been discussing in previous podcasts. Also, starting with lower speeds gives the opportunity for the new standards being developed to mature. That could potentially provide more choices for the second generation of Cepheid, of the Cepheid project, where they try to reach for even faster speeds. In fact, the project also includes a roadmap activity. The IEEE article includes this roadmap activity to identify the best alternative for a second generation of Cepheid. And that will target at least 1 gigabit per second, and its feasibility will also be studied and linked to the future technology planned for space devices. So this is us
trying to figure out how to get flexible networking and communications in outer space for some of our future space missions.
That's not something you would normally think about, is where you're placing your instruments or computers on a spacecraft. Like
but engineers think about that. Yeah, engineers think about that. And that's why I wanted to highlight this. It's not something people think about.
Yeah, it is something that people think about, because they're like, right. Oh, like how I like my setup, like my router is like 2 rooms over from me, and I have a 25-foot cable. Like, it's like, okay, like I can just get one of those. If I needed a 50-foot, I could just go to back to Best Buy and get the same one. But longer length, and it's not something we think about like that is a necessity. It's like, oh, like there's like, it's you're just taking something that you're doing terrestrially and just putting it in space, when no, the requirements to be able to do those things is so much higher.
The most minute details are what get you in space.
It's almost like we've spent our entire history on the planet and haven't had to develop technologies to work off planet.
Right. I mean, we're just talking about the transceiver here. Not even, I mean, they're talking about the cable because the cable has to fit in the transceiver, but just the thing at your router, all right? Just the plug at your router that turns analog signals to digital signals and vice versa. That's something that you have to spend a good chunk of money on in order, even before you go and design the network for your spacecraft.
That's, I guess, what people often think about with space, or there's something that people think about often with spacecraft is, oh, you just build it. And then you go to, if you need an Ethernet cable, you go to Best Buy, or you order one on Amazon if you're Blue Origin. You're just like, hey, like, can I get this drone delivered? That's our thought process, because that's how everything works here. When you're in space, it's like, you have to think, how can this one cable go wrong and screw everything up for everybody involved?
Well, that, and the flip side is there are just so many physical factors that can impact you in space, right? And we deal with this all the time in the biology space as well. You know, talking about, you know, things as simple as digestion or
blood flow,
different forms of sleep, blood flow, yeah, things like that. You know, ways that certain diseases can affect you. All of these. There are so many compounding factors for a mission to Mars. This is going to be one of the hardest studies that humanity has ever done. It is or one of the most detailed studies at the very least.
It'll be a challenge, but we're up for it. Now, you mentioned a planet name.
I think it was the God of War. It might
Ares. The planet remember. Ares? No.
No. What did the other group call him? Mars.
Mars. Okay. So anyway,
yes.
Humans to Venus. No. So this is sort of our culminating segment. We're just about to hit an hour of the podcast. So
we're not doing too bad.
We're not doing too bad. We're getting, I mean, if you're just tuning in, me and Newton have a history of saying, all right, we're going to record a 45-minute episode, and then it ends up being like an hour and 45 minutes. So we kind of got it right, but like a little, like at least a standard deviation off.
There were less politics in this one. I think that's what helped.
Yeah, we wanted to ease people into it now. There's a reason why we are the most opinionated space policy and technology podcast on the internet. We do not hold back. We love arguments. Anyway, Humans to Mars. I just switched over on my browser, and it's the cool graphic where with EDL, the entry, descent, and landing, what do they call it? The supersonic retrograde thrusters.
Thrusters,
just going. Anyway, so the Humans to Mars Summit is the penultimate, not even penultimate, the ultimate summit of Mars anything. It is
for now.
basically we're
until
we actually have humans on Mars summit in 2033.
You think they'll let us volunteer for that one too?
Sure. I don't see why not.
Put it on.
Turnout might be a little low. Anyway, Explore Mars, one of the leading space advocacy nonprofits on the planet, in the galaxy, puts on an annual summit at George Washington University called Humans to Mars. This is, I think, 17th year, 15th year, something like that. We've been doing this for quite a while. It's every May, and it brings everybody who's anybody and puts them all into the same room to talk about Mars, to talk about the human missions to Mars and what we need to do in the interim. The panels this year range everything from, we have the multiple associate administrators of NASA all coming together to talk about what their individual directorates and divisions are working to do to get us to Mars. We have a Hollywood and Mars panel this year talking about the impact of Hollywood and culture, whether that's movies or books or art or music, whatever it is, sort of that big ball of culture that we have, the zeitgeist of the time, and how that impacts not only our perception of a human mission to Mars, but even the design of the human mission to Mars. I mean, missions to Mars have been in the works since von Braun's days in the 1950s. I'm sure he was even dreaming of it in the 1940s between building V2 rockets. We've gone through so many iterations and architectures, but we're finally getting to that point where we're putting money where, at least NASA and the U.S. government is putting money where our mouth is and starting to develop these systems. You've heard us talk about SLS and Orion and the Deep Space Gateway and Deep Space Transport. Those are the next iterations on this journey to Mars, this human journey to Mars. And so the Humans to Mars Summit is the ultimate Mars summit. If you want to know anything about what's going on on that journey, tune in. We have linked in the show notes the link to h2m.exploremars.org, and from there you can watch it for free.
There's a
live stream. Yeah. Or if you want to show up, it's at George Washington University. It's right close to two metro stations, the Foggy Bottom one and the Farragut West one. Yeah, Newton. This is your second H2M. This is my third.
It's my second H2M, but unfortunately I won't be there during the day. I'll only be attending H2M after hours.
That's when the fun begins.
Yeah. I'll be at the evening receptions there, networking, chatting with people, letting celebrities talk to me, that sort of thing. But yeah, no, I think it's a great event. I remember just being very surprised last year at just how big it was and how many leaders in the space community are there. I mean, you have people from all different places in NASA. You have tons of people from the private sector, including Vector, the group that we talked about earlier. You'll have some people from Boeing, people from Lockheed, Orbital, SpaceX, so on and so forth. All there talking about the current state of the technology required to get us to Mars, the current state of policy required to get us there, and where we need to go from there in the opinions of the people who are studying this stuff, who are embedded in this topic, and who will be studying it for the next decade and a half before we get there. You also have quite a number of just influential people, and just amazing panels there as well. You have panels that stretch from Mars architectures and cislunar, where they'll be talking about cislunar, where they'll be talking about some cislunar habitation prior to getting to Mars, like the Deep Space Gateway. You have things like sex and gender in human space exploration. You touch on all of these different topics, and like we just said in the previous section, you have to hit so many different topics to complete this mission, and it really underscores just how difficult this mission is. This is beyond the moon. Look, the moon was hard. The moon was the hardest thing we'd ever done in the 1960s. And now we're going to come up against the hardest thing we've ever done, once again, as a human race, when in trying to get to Mars. I think that it's in some cases, it's kind of seen as an inevitability. There are folks who will say, oh, we'll just go there as a one-way trip. There are folks who who think that we already have the technology to go there. The technology's not invented yet. As I was just, talking about internet transceivers,
we can't even get back to the moon yet.
Right. Exactly. And this is much farther, dealing with much harsher concerns like radiation. Not that you don't deal with radiation on the way to the moon, but this is significantly more.
It's 6 months as opposed to 3 days.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a feeling this conference is only going to get bigger and bigger as we approach the date.
Oh, absolutely.
As we approach the 2030s.
Absolutely. I mean, this is probably the biggest year. I mean, we have acting administrator Robert Lightfoot coming. Like, this is, I mean, he's, if you look at a pie chart of the space agencies around the globe, NASA takes up over 50% of the world's space budgets. And he is in charge of that.
And as announced recently, the NASA spending bill does push for, studies for how to get to Mars that were occurring, but has been recently reported to have been mandated by the president. But NASA's focus is on Mars. There's a good chunk of the private sector with a focus on Mars. We have some international cooperation, including, representatives from the United Arab Emirates Space Center that will be there.
JAXA, France.
Like I said, this is the mission of our generation. This is it. So get excited. Come to Humans to Mars. If you can't come, if you can't register, check out the live stream. Follow it on Twitter, #humans2TO Mars.
We've had that conversation multiple times today, haven't we, Newton?
Yes. Yeah.
The hashtag is #humans2Mars spelled out.
To Mars with TO. Yes. Just follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. They'll be broadcasting it everywhere.
And just be sure to follow along. It is your annual update on the trajectory that we're going down. And if you're not a civil space person, if you wholeheartedly believe in Elon Musk's abilities, there's people from SpaceX that are going to be there. I mean, there's people from Boeing and Lockheed Martin, Thales Alenia, Honeywell. I mean, like, basically every contractor or entity that wants to go to Mars or has a stake in Mars is there.
And you have a lot of fun people there too. Leonard David will be there. Astronaut Abby. Who else is going to be there, Jay?
Buzz Aldrin. Edwin Buzz Aldrin.
A gentleman by the name of Buzz Aldrin will be there, whoever that is. But yeah, there's gonna be a number of folks there from just each of the different, from people who are popularizing space and advocating for space exploration, to the implementers, the doers, the creators, the people who are trying to make Mars happen, for lack of a better phrase. Everyone's going to be at this, so it's definitely worthwhile.
Yeah. So
anything else on Humans to Mars?
That, I think, is it. That I think is all she wrote.
And special thanks to Debbie Cohen for putting this on, for helping put
Debbie
this on.
Cohen, Chris Carberry, Josh Powers, Wade Holler, me.
Jack Corral.
This is going to be a great year. It's going to be the best. It's the best year.
We're the best
summits to go to Mars. Come, please visit, say hi. And if you are listening to this and you are an attendant of H2M, come find me. I will be the person running around with like a chicken with their head cut off. Just come find me and tell me that you enjoy the podcast. If you do.
And in the evening, come find me and have a beer.
Newton, why do you get to do all the fun things? I'm over here working.
This is all scientists do.
Yeah.
So
big science.
All right. We are only 10 minutes over.
Yeah. No, I am very proud of us. We hit our mark. So in order for me to get sleep for H2M, and for Newton to get sleep for work, I think we will be signing off soon. Now.
Yep.
And yeah. So again, reiterate, come to H2M. A lot of fun, a lot of cool stuff going on in space. Be sure to tune in next week for our summit recap, which is going to be great. Yeah. It's going to be the best.
Yeah.
Follow us on Twitter at @astra_podcast. Follow us or like us on Facebook. We have an Instagram. It's the same handle as Twitter. We do have an Instagram. Sign up at elemental.fm to get email updates from the team. And remember, elemental.fm/win. We have a handful of people who have signed up. Like, you could win a book, a really, really good book.
Free signed book. A book signed by the author.
A valuable book for the future of the species. That is David Grinspoon's Earth in Human Hands, a signed copy. Elemental.fm/win. That is all she wrote. So as always, I'm Jack.
And I'm Newton.
Ad Astra.